Hey guys, our decline here, average picker. So sorry I've not been, haven't done an upload recently. It's been really busy. My time has not been my own. But I thought we'd take a look at something today because undoubtedly when you tell people you pick locks, somebody ends up asking you, so is lock picking like it is in the movies? And of course the answer to that we know is no, it's not. Now, of course, that's the real short answer, and that's pretty much what you have to give when you're talking to somebody about it, because they don't want to get in, they don't want to hear all the nuances of tensioning and all of that. But from a writing perspective, I think it gets kind of interesting, because what you're trying to do is obviously advance the plot, because your general audience, they don't care about the lock, right? What they want to just see is we've got to get the character, we have to move him along, we've got to get the character into the room and discover the clue or have the confrontation or whatever it is they need in order to continue the plot along. And so you have to deal, but you have to deal with it. It's a reality. People lock their doors. And so what you end up doing is either the character has a profession where it's generally accepted that they might know how to pick a lock. And so by this I mean like police, detectives, private investigators, FBI, CIA, secret agents, anything like that. We, as an audience, we kind of accept, oh, they would probably carry lock picks and they would know how to pick a lock. On the other hand, you get the everyman kind of scenario, and you can't really, why would this character be carrying lock picks? And so what they usually end up doing is, you know, they pluck a hairpin out, or they find a bit of metal on the ground or something, and they stick it in there. And now what's interesting is they have to explain this somehow, right? Like the writer is aware they've got to sort of explain how this everyday person can pick a lock. And it's usually like a one-off line. And that one-off line is usually something like, pick the lock open, and they're like, don't ask, misspent youth, or something like that, which is interesting because it hints, it gives the character a little bit of depth, a little bit, not a whole lot, but it hints at that there's this shady aspect to knowing how to pick a lock, right? Misspent youth or something like that, or you know, my brother used to steal cars or something, or there's all kinds of little one-off sentences that the character will use, and they usually imply something nefarious. Some kind of action they really shouldn't have been involved in, but they put that behind them now. Don't worry about it. Point is, we got into the room and we're okay now. And I think that's kind of interesting because we give this pass to, like, I guess the more what we would generally lump into the law enforcement kind of professions. But if we have to explain it away in any other way, we give this, you know, weird hint of a bad past. Interestingly enough, I think too, we also, as a general audience, we give that pass to the other side of it, where you've got like the serial killer or the psycho deranged killer or something. We don't question how they got into the house or the apartment, right, to tie up the family or whatever. They obviously, they would know how to pick a lock, right? It's a serial killer. He knows what he's doing. He's not going to be thwarted by a locked door. We don't often see that entry. It could be they came through a window or something, maybe, or yeah. But I think it's interesting. We accept they were able to get in. You know, law enforcement's able to get in, and people with shady pasts are able to do this thing. Now there are a few interesting cases out there, and I'd be pressed to try to think of one off the top of my head. But where you do get a little more attention to detail on the lock picking, and like the person's looked up, you know, they need attention or something like that, and so it's a little more, we're not zoomed in, we're not focused on it, but it's a little more nuanced in there. I get a little more detail, and from a writing perspective, that's sort of interesting. It can mean one of two things. Either I think the person took some time and looked up a little bit about, say, lock picking, or that's what their actual interest is. Because there's this weird aspect, I call it weird, it's not that, it shouldn't be surprising at all. Writers, you can't, professional writers and really good writers, it's very hard to tell. And this is one of the dividing lines, I think, that separates really good writers and professional writers from your more amateur writers. your more amateur writers, you can tell what their interests are by where they choose to focus aspects of the story. If, like, say, use The Martian, for example, and it got turned into that movie, Matt Damon, he goes up to Mars and chaos ensues and he's left alone on there, and then he has to science the hell out of this or something like that, and get home. And it's based off this book. And it's an interesting read, but it's an interesting read from a science perspective, applied into like a fictional story. And you can tell that the writer's interest is in the science, right? The writer's interest is not necessarily in Mars in and of itself, or in this adventure story or anything like that. The whole plot there is a delivery system for, you know, everything from trying to grow food in a different environment to, you know, astrophysics and where was I? Yeah, their interest is in, like, you know, astrophysics and orbital mechanics and things like that. That's where that writer's interest is, and I don't think it takes away from the book, but it makes it interesting that you can zero in on things and tell, what is this person actually interested in. And you can tell where they put the detail. You know, if you get a lot of detail about cars, you can usually rest assured somewhere the writer themselves are interested in cars. If you get a lot of weird, bad information about cars, it's of no interest to the writer. They simply didn't take any time to research, and they needed to have the person in a fast car or something like that. So, you know, they may say weird things about, you know, mentioning spoilers or, you know, superchargers or something like that. They've picked up a few keywords and they go, that makes a car fast. And so you end up with sometimes these weird scenarios of no explanation why the character is driving a Civic with, like, you know, 700 horsepower or something. Because it's just the writer doesn't care. The writer only is concerned with the delivery that the character has a Civic, and it's somehow got to keep up with something and get somewhere quickly or whatever, you know. I would argue and say the writers, can we call them writers? The machines that crank out the Fast and Furious movies, they don't care about cars. Their concern is not about cars. You know, their concern is just about writing a movie where cars go quick, you know, and they're trying to deliver something to the audience, and so you get the weird thing of, like, floor panels falling out of the vehicle and stuff as it shakes itself apart on this quarter-mile run. It's ridiculous. But we digress a little bit there. So interestingly, though, I think in literature, because we weren't really pushing movies at the time, but we have this whole genre that actually developed out, and it's called the locked room, or sometimes it's called the impossible murder, but it's the locked room mystery, and you find this in a lot of murder mysteries, of course. Edgar Allan Poe wrote Murders in the Rue, and I think that's generally credited as one of the first locked room mysteries. There's another one a little bit beforehand. It's really expansively titled. It's like Passage in the History of a Countess, of an Irish Countess. And I forget who wrote it, like Fawn or somebody like that. And there's a little bit of discrepancy who came up with the locked room first. Not overly important, I don't think, in this case. You know, you've got people, though, that went on and they turned it into a whole genre. You know, you got Carter Dickens did it, Agatha Christie, probably more famous than Carter, used a lot of locked rooms. But it's interesting because as a basic concept, it is centered around the room being locked. You know, and so it discounts, and these locks can't be picked. You know, at no point is the suggestion made that the lock was picked and then relocked or anything. It's just, you've got a dead body in a room. There might be a clue or two as to what might have happened. I think in Murder in the Rue, there's like a couple coins and like one of those shaving razors, like a straight razor. You know, and then a hair. I think there's a hair or something that doesn't belong to a person. I forget. It's been a long time since I read it. So you get a couple clues, but the room itself is locked. The window's locked. The door is locked. And at no point does a detective or anybody go, well, maybe they picked the lock. It's taken for granted. The room was locked, therefore you can't get in. So how could the person have done it? Writing wise, I'll point out it's really hard. It's actually really hard to write a locked room scenario without getting just crazy mechanics with it. Because you don't want to rip somebody off, right? So you've got to kind of come up with your own twist on the locked room, and it's been done so much. I mean, you saw the rise of careers around the locked room mystery, and you saw the demise of careers around the locked room mystery because they ran out of things. I mean, I forget which story it is. There's one with like a beach. It's a beach or snow. Something that would leave footprints, and there's like one set of footprints or no sets of footprints and a dead body. And it's like, wow, how did it happen? And then you find out it fell from a balloon or something like that. It's kind of weird. And I did do a locked room once. It was sort of a sketch series of stories that I had done, and I did a locked room. But the way I did it, like, I went the mechanical route. I had the chandelier is what crushed one of the people, and it was on like a pulley system that the killer went up into the attic and dropped the chandelier on the guy. How he knew when the person was going to be right under the chandelier, I don't know. Luckily, the story was shallow enough I didn't have to address the timing of that or anything like that. But for consistency's sake, I did put all the chandeliers on the same type of pulley system, and it wasn't without some research because the house was old, and there's a little bit of an establishment that your chandeliers would actually have extended up into the attic and been mounted on the joists, on the ceiling joists. And so I just kind of played with that concept, and I rigged them all the same way. But yeah, that was my locked room. It worked all right for what it did what it needed to do. We'll put it that way. Now a good locked room mystery has enough clues there to bring the audience in and let you as the viewer or the reader figure it out, or at least develop an idea. That's how a good locked room is done. So, it'd be possible, I guess, to do it with lock picking, but you'd have to drop some clues off in there. Maybe as you're going over suspects or something, have somebody if you just say they're related to a locksmith, you could use that as a red herring, I guess. But it would be a little obvious, wouldn't it? Now there's the lazy form, the lazy writer who is just, it's what they're concerned about. They're more concerned about the twist than anything else. The lazy version is to insert a secret passage or something like that you don't tell the reader about until the very end. So there's no way, really, unless the person just jumps to some weird conclusion, or just goes, well, it has to be a secret passage, and that turns out to be the case, that they could know. And that's kind of the lazy way out, I think. The clues need to be there. You can't just say, oh yeah, and then Daphne went through, the trap door behind the wardrobe, and we need clues to give us a hint that there is a secret passage there somehow. So that we have to carry the character and the plot along. I think my favorite ways of dealing with the characters coming up to a locked door, I like the landlord. I like the landlord or the neighbor who just lets the people in. They have for whatever reason they have a key. With the landlord, we kind of assume the landlord's got a key to the property. Sorry about that. They just let the character in. It's a graceful way to do it, I think. The problem with using the landlord or something is you've got to get the character gracefully there, unlock the door, and you've got to get the character to gracefully exit, because otherwise you're carrying an extra character in your scene. And I'm not claiming to be a professional writer at all, but that's problematic to have this strange character that we've just met floating around for some reason. And most often, you've seen this all the time in Law and Order, probably. Most often this is just handled. You get the landlord out of the picture by having them just not like the person, the tenant. They go, yeah, the guy's a creep and he's 4 months behind on rent, and just opens the door and lets the police in and leaves, because I don't like the guy, so whatever, just go right in. But again, we've got the law enforcement thing that carries some authority. You could, with the neighbor, you could arguably have like an everyday man social engineer their way in, maybe talk to the neighbor. Oh yeah, he's supposed to be out of town or something, and I'm feeding his goldfish or whatever, or he said he left the check on the fridge and I have to get it for him, or something. It's some form of social engineering. But then again, you run the risk of slowing the plot down. So do we just have the character whip out a hairpin and hint at some nefarious criminal past and quickly pick the lock open in a completely unrealistic way, but in a way that keeps the story going? And so I guess it starts to beg the question, and again, I'm not claiming to be anything close to a professional writer. I've just written a lot. How would I handle it? I'm very consciously aware I could show too much detail on lock picking. I think with an everyday kind of person, I wouldn't address it, or I would have somehow have established it earlier. The character has an interest in locks. Maybe just you could spot name brands here and there, maybe have the character do that, or name drop maybe a few name things here and there, just as you're building up to whatever this confrontation is or whatever it is you need for the lock. Have the character, maybe as they're walking behind a mall or something, they're like, oh, that's a Medico or something, and then when they come up to the door, they could just, it was a Schleg, it wasn't a problem. Right? A residential Schleg, it wasn't a problem. It was a quick set, non-smart key. That's a little bit more detail probably than you need, but just don't address it. You don't want to get into too much detail. Do you really want to also have all these passages, about spools and binding orders? And that's weird. And that's, that's what made me want to do this topic, because it's kind of this collision of two interests of mine, locks and writing, and they don't really mesh that well. It would be strange to have a story where suddenly there's a lot of detail about a lock or about locks. It just doesn't work. There's more interesting solutions maybe too. Just have the character find another way in. Have the character wait it out. Ring the doorbell. Did anyone come to the door? No. Okay, then the character sits in their car for 2 days or something. Like a good old stakeout. Waits till the person comes home to confront them, or something that gives them an in. And you see it in like stories set in like New York and things, where they're in or Chicago, any kind of place where a lot of people are living and sharing a high rise, and you have the main door into like a lobby area. Somebody might just wait until someone comes in and then they rush in behind them. If they think ahead, they might have bags of groceries and somebody holds the door actually, and that at least gets them part way into the building. So I think that's probably how I'd be more prone to handle it. I try not to have the character rely, or I try not to have my plot rely on the character all of a sudden producing a skill. So, but that's just me. That's how I do it. I wrote a story one time centered around pirate radio, and it was real obvious. It was real obvious. Like I cared about pirate radio, and I knew about pirate radio. But since the story itself was about pirate radio, it kind of made sense. So it sort of worked, but it created it created a flat character. The characters changed a little bit. You don't have dramatic change necessarily in a short story, but it flattened the characters because you could see my interest was in the transmitters and frequencies and things like that, and in the building of the station and stuff. My interest wasn't in the characters as much. Yeah, not that great. I think it would be a little bit interesting too, though, if the characters were thwarted, by something like a lock, in a way. Like, there is an appeal there to grind the story down into a halt or something, because of something like a lock. They come up to the door and, maybe like an Ocean's 11, Ocean's 12 story, like all of a sudden it's just, oh, well, yeah, I'm a good lock picker, but, this door's got 2 medicos on it, we're going to have to figure out a way to buy more time or something. I saw a door the other day, a steel door at a mall, and it was locked with 2 medicos, which I thought was interesting. And that would certainly slow you down, I think, right? You'd have to remove the time limitations if you were trying to write that as a story and the people getting in. Now, I know some of you out there, you're amazing, and you could probably get through 2 medicos in, I don't know, 8 minutes or something, let's say. But I don't know about under some kind of a time crunch element where that's important. So you'd have to eliminate that somehow to buy the characters more time, or just have it thwart them completely, which could be funny. Maybe that's the movie we need. Maybe we need average pickers 11 or something, right? Where they get moderately through their heist, and then they're thwarted by just a little bit higher level of security lock. I don't know if there's a good story in that, but there is an amusing factor, I think. Average 11. I don't know. Don't know what that would look like. Okay, so yeah, I know this has been kind of just a random romp, looking at the realism of locks and its collision with trying to write a story or in a movie or something. Hopefully you've hung in here. I don't know. To me, it's kind of an interesting topic. It's one of those things kind of interesting to dwell on. And I did a lot of editing, so you wouldn't have to hear me ramble a whole lot. But I think from a lock picker's perspective, there are just some interesting things in there, that your everyday man is typically hinted as some kind of shady background. I think that's interesting. I think it shows the general perception, I think, that's out there of what lock pickers do. It puts that in it constructs a certain social context around lock picking. Because like I said, I've done that thing about, things I can't stand that people bring up when you mention you do lock sport, and undoubtedly breaking into something is always up there, and it's kind of constructed probably around that aspect. So yeah, I think that's interesting. And I also, if you are into much reading, those old locked room mysteries, they are interesting. They are neat. It gets a little less interesting as they start to eliminate the actual room itself. But from a lock picking perspective, again, and I don't know the dates. I should look up the dates on this stuff. I don't know a whole lot about the whole history of lock picking either. But I mean, it would have been established because we would have had, we would have had people picking. Wouldn't have been an unknown skill, right? Because Sherlock Holmes has lock picking, especially the modern day versions, but even the older books. So yeah, but I think it's interesting. The locked room. It's just this given. Like, well, obviously, they didn't pick the lock. Right, there was something sneakier going on, and again, I just think it's an interesting concept that, as a general audience, we throw in and we just accept. Oh, the door was locked. Must have been something else, right? I find that interesting from the lock picking perspective. It doesn't come up, well, maybe the guy just knows how to pick locks. Maybe that's it. He picked the lock, he went in, he killed the dude, and freaking left. No, it's got to be sneakier. It's got to be sneakier because the door was locked. How else could they have gotten in? No other possible way in. And sometimes it does overlook the fact, you know, that, well, our investigators got in somehow, right? So that they could get in through the door. Maybe the other guy could have too. So anyway, yeah, just a fun little romp there. Man, this week has been crazy. I've not gotten a lot of picking done. I'm picking awful at the moment as well. I do want to start on some of those challenge locks from Squint though. He sent some really fantastic ones, and I've got to get started on those, but probably gonna have to sit down and get some practicing done. This just was an easy way to do something about locks, get another video up, and combine, you know, a couple things that I like, writing, movies, and locks. So there we go, guys. In the meantime, have a good one.